biology students, welcome, and today we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about the cell membrane. We've already learned a little bit about what the cell membrane is and what the cell membrane does. Today I'm going to be going a little bit more in depth into not just what does it do, but some of the structures that make up the cell membrane and some of the different functions that we haven't talked about yet. So last class we learned a little bit about stuff going in and out of cells. That's something I want to talk a little bit about today, but I'm also going to talk about three other functions of the cell membrane and the structures that help them work. So let's go ahead and get started. You should have your notebook out or the note sheet to go ahead and follow along as we go. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about, the first job of the cell membrane that we talked about when we were doing the different organelles, is just the main job, the number one job of the cell membrane is it separates the cells from its surroundings. So this is the membrane here. Basically everything within that cell membrane is the cell. Everything that's outside of that is not the cell. So that's the number one job. Without that, nothing else is really important. So I'm going to list that as function number one because that's the single most important thing that it does. It defines the cell and it keeps the contents of the cell within. So what is it that actually helps the cell do that? We've learned a little bit about phospholipids. We learned that name during the first unit when we did the biochemistry stuff. So phospholipids make this double layer, we call it a lipid bilayer, that creates a barrier that goes all the way around the cell. This is an animation of sort of what that looks like. We've got the heads of the lipids here, and then this hydrocarbon chain that flips down into the middle. So there's a term for that. We use the term hydrophilic. That means the head part of these lipids here. That's where it gets its name phospholipid because it has a phosphorus in it. That part of the lipid is actually attracted to water. Hydrophilic means water loving. So water on the outside of the cell, that head is drawn towards it. The water in the cytoplasm inside the cell, the head is drawn towards that. But there's a second part to the lipid, and that's that long chain of carbon and hydrogens that we learned about before. That chain is what we call hydrophobic. That means it's afraid of water. What that in actuality looks like is that if you put those lipids with water, they will not mix together. Think about the water lab that we did and how the water and the vegetable oil wouldn't mix together even when you stirred it up. That's the same idea with this part of the lipid. So what that ends up creating is this double barrier, this double layer. It's a fluid, movable thing like you see in this animation, but the heads flip towards the water, the tails flip away from it, and it creates this barrier all the way around the cell that keeps stuff in and keeps stuff out. So that's the first and probably most important job of the cell membrane. The second job of the cell membrane, one that we've also talked a little bit about, is that it regulates what goes in and out of the cell. So it's not strictly a wall where nothing can go in and out. There actually are openings within it, and those openings are kind of protein. We call these protein channels. So here's what one of those might look like. This is the lipid bilayer, and then this is a protein. This purple object in the animation, that is a protein, and you can see this one is open and it's allowing water molecules to go in and out. The water and other substances are going to obey that rule that we learned about last class, the osmosis and diffusion. That stuff moves from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So in this case, there's more water inside the cell, so it's diffusing out through osmosis outside of the cell. So there's one protein, here's another one. In this case, it's bringing something into the cell. But protein channels change how a membrane works because instead of being a stiff, strict barrier that nothing can go in and out of, this is sort of like the door that can open and close, or like a window that's always open. There are ways that things can get in and out of the cell. So that's the second function of the cell membrane, and we're going to go now into the third one, and the next function of the cell. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Wanted to talk a little bit about osmosis and diffusion again. So this is a topic that we went to last class. The cell membrane diffuses stuff in and out. This is a process that does not take energy. Those processes, osmosis and diffusion, they happen just when you have a high concentration of something and a low concentration of something, stuff is going to move. In this case, it's moving outside of the cell. So this is not something that the cell needs to spend energy to do. This can happen with things like water, oxygen, nutrients, other materials that the cells need. All right, now we'll move on to function number 3. So function number 3 is something that we haven't really talked about with the cell membrane, but some of the materials in the cell membrane actually serve as the cell's identification. They have proteins and carbohydrates on the surface of the cell that, instead of letting things in and out, they're a thing that the cell uses to identify that this belongs to the cell, that this belongs to you. Now, why would the cell need that? It has everything to do with the defense mechanisms of the cell. Your body, your immune system, needs to know what belongs to you, what doesn't belong to you. Things that don't belong to you, things like harmful bacteria, viruses, they want to attack those, they want to get those out. Your own body, they want to make sure that they don't attack those things, that they leave those things alone. And that's where these cell surface markers come in. So there are proteins and carbohydrates on the surface of the cell that your immune system can read. So white blood cells come along and they monitor things along the cells, and when they see something that they know, they leave it alone and they move along. When they see something that they don't know, that might mean that they mount an immune response. So this is one of the things, sort of an interesting application of this. This is why different blood types exist, right? And why you can't get a blood transfusion from someone that's not the same blood type as you. If you have blood type A, for example, you would have certain markers on your cell that your body would recognize. But somebody else has a different marker here. They might have blood type B, which would mean somebody with blood type A would not recognize that. And if they got transfusion of the wrong blood type, their body would attack those blood cells that they didn't recognize. Now, there's also blood type O. You've maybe heard of that. There's A, B, there's AB, and then there's also O. So there are 4 different main blood types. Somebody that has blood type O, they basically would not have those markers there, and so the immune system wouldn't attack them. So if you've ever heard people say that they're the universal donor, what they're talking about is blood type O, because they don't have on their blood cells those markers that would be attacked by anyone's immune system. This also has to do with why you can't, if people need an organ transplant, they can't just get an organ transplant from anyone, because their immune system recognizes their cells and doesn't recognize other cells that don't belong to their body. So these cell surface markers, these proteins, play a really important job in helping our body recognize what's ours and what doesn't belong in our body. One other medical application of this, there actually are some diseases they call autoimmune diseases where your body makes mistakes and it actually starts to attack its own cells. So things like arthritis is an example of that, diabetes is an example of that, lupus is an example of that. So there are diseases where your body doesn't recognize its own cells and sometimes destroys some of the cells that it shouldn't be. So these proteins and carbohydrates in the cell play a really important job for cell identification. We saw this video earlier of the white blood cell chasing the bacteria, the same idea there. How does this white blood cell know to attack the bacteria and not to attack its own red blood cells? That's because of those cell surface markers. Okay, and then our fourth and final thing that we're going to talk about for functions of the cell membrane, the fourth thing is that this is actually the part of the cell that helps it communicate with other cells and with other things outside of the cell. So in this case, it's another kind of protein. They're called receptor proteins, and these receptor proteins are also found in the lipid bilayer. And they are proteins that can accept, they've got that same unique shape, so one thing fits in there. We learned about how proteins have a unique shape. In this case, this protein, this receptor protein, has a shape that's going to allow this hormone to attach to it. And what that hormone does is it sends a signal through that channel, and it might release something else. It's going to stimulate some response within the cell. So, cells do not exist by themselves. There are literally trillions of them in your body, and they have to be able to communicate, and they have to get messages from one cell to another, and from one part of the body to another part of the body, and These receptor proteins are part of how that happens. So your body can send out signals. Sometimes it's very quick, but sometimes things like hormones, that's more of a long-term signal that it can send that from one part of the body to another, and those changes in the cells might take place over a longer period of time. So receptor proteins play another important job with helping cells communicate with other cells and with other parts of the body. So, just to summarize, the cell membrane, it's one of the organelles that we already learned about, but in some ways it's an especially important part of the cell because it's the cell's way of communicating with the outside world. It has four main functions that we talked about here today. So those four main things are, one, it creates the barrier around the cell that creates the cell. So that's the lipid bilayer that does that. Number two, it has channels, protein channels that allow things in and out of the cell. So it allows stuff to go in and out, going through osmosis and diffusion. Number three, it's the source of the cell's identification. This is how the cell knows that, how the body knows that these cells belong to you and that they're not part of a bacteria or something else. And then the fourth thing here that we just talked about, the cell membrane also allows cells to communicate with other cells. So that wraps up our notes for today. For the rest of the class period, you guys are going to be working on finishing a virtual lab that looks at this process of osmosis and diffusion within cells. How does stuff move in and out of cells? We're going to address some of those terms like hypertonic and hypotonic that we learned from last class. So the rest of the period today is going to be working on that virtual lab. It's on Google Classroom, and that needs to be finished up and done before the beginning of next class. That's all, and have a good rest of your day.